Okay, I want to take a look at something today that gets people in trouble on occasion, and it's taken out of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 22. And usually what happens is they only quote the last half of this verse, where Paul says, "I become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some." And so what they do is they kind of fall off into this ecumenical form of deception, to where you give heed to just about anything, even if it's sin, for the sake of trying to win somebody to your conviction of Christianity. Now, the problem, of course, is that verse is somewhat taken out of context. Backing up to verse 19, I'll just read the context of it here. Paul says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became a Jew, that I might win Jews, and to those who were under the law, as under the law, though myself, being myself under the law, that I might win those who were under the law. And to those who were without the law, as without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some." Okay, so we don't become a prostitute to win people to Christ, or we don't become a drug addict to win drug addicts to Christ. Paul, what he's talking about here is, he of course was a Jew, and so he understood their tradition. But ultimately, he was trying to reach the Gentiles who, oftentimes they didn't have a clue about Jewish tradition. And so at one place in Galatians, you see where Paul got into a debate with Peter over the fact that Peter, even though he was saved by grace, when some Jews showed up, he put himself under the law and began to basically put himself under a form of legalism. And Paul rebuked him for it, and he basically said, if you being a Jew, why is it that you've been preaching this grace all along, and now all of a sudden you put yourself back under the law? And that's kind of what the whole book of Galatians is about. And in the very first chapter of Galatians, Paul says, if anybody comes and preaches another gospel, even if it's from an angel of heaven, let him be accursed. So this is not a minor issue here. If you try to put people under rules and regulations of whether it be Jewish tradition or Mormon temple ritual traditions or any of that kind of stuff, which is added to the gospel, then it brings a curse upon the gospel. It's no longer the gospel of grace, it's the gospel of works. And that's basically what has happened with Mormonism and some of the other religions that have popped up, at least in the West, is they started out with a gospel. Actually, Mormonism didn't start out with a gospel at all. It started out with something totally different. But however, what they're trying to do now, over the past couple of decades, is they begin to try to disassociate themselves from the angel Moroni. You don't even see the angel on top of a lot of the newer temples. And you don't see him talk a whole lot about Doctrine and Covenants or Pearl of Great Price or any of those two books. If they give you a free book, it's going to be the Book of Mormon, which is chock full of quotes out of the Bible. So it's a little easier for them to pass that off as a gospel piece of literature or some kind of scripture, because they can quote things out of the Book of Mormon that are word for word taken from the King James Bible, because they plagiarized. Whoever wrote the Book of Mormon, whether it was Solomon Spaulding or somebody else, they plagiarized from the King James Bible. So you have to be aware of this kind of thing. Now, sometimes Christians will naively quote out of Revelation 22, where it says, let's see, in verse 19, if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part from the tree of life and from the holy city which are written in this book. And they think this is referring to the whole Bible, which it's not. It's actually referring to the book of Revelation. So obviously that creates a problem, because what the Mormons will do is they're going to quote out of Deuteronomy 4, I think verse 2, where Moses said basically the same thing. If you add to, what he had written, the book of the law, then, the same thing's going to happen. You're going to be added some curses to your life and all that kind of thing. So you have to understand that that principle applies not to just the book of Revelation, but it actually applies to all the scripture as a whole. But the Mormons, of course, they're going to try to debate with you that this is only about the book of Revelation, and see, they're going to say, well, Moses, he said the same thing, but look all the stuff that's been added since, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, or he put together the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. So you have to be aware of some of these little tricks that the cultists will use on you to back you into a corner. Now, this time of year, one of the things we run into is Christians and the Mormons as well. They will have their Easter Sunday meeting, and then the problem is they add, especially for the kids, Easter egg hunts, and next thing you know, you got bunnies and eggs and all this kind of stuff, which has nothing to do with the gospel. And that creates a problem. I can understand it being an innocent little thing for kids, but I grew up in that kind of environment, and it took me until, I was in my mid-20s, actually begin to read the Bible for myself, and I began to have the same questions that a lot of people have. What does the bunnies and all this other stuff have to do with Easter? Well, nothing. See, this was stuff that was added later. It was tradition, actually pagan traditions from the fertility gods that date back even prior to Christ, that during the time of springtime, obviously when everything is, the blossoms and everything are coming alive, trees are coming alive again, a lot of the pagan religions had fertility rituals that they did. And of course, bunnies have lots of offspring, and and fish have lots of eggs, and so you see the fish tradition and all these different things that ended up, as the Catholics might have been saying back in those days, well, we become all things that we might win some. We became a pagan that we might win pagans. See, that's the danger that we find when we start adding this kind of stuff to our religious festivals and meetings. So when you begin to go down that road, it isn't long before Peter becomes the rock instead of Christ being the rock. And of course, that's obviously a problem, because our faith has to be upon something a little bit more solid than Peter, because Peter was, a guy that was given to emotional extremes.